Friends, welcome to SCILET Live, our digital platform for interaction with creative writers and public intellectuals. I'm very happy to welcome the students and teachers of the American College, Lady Doe College, and other colleges, and our old students and friends of SCILET, particularly our friends from Aravind Eye Hospital. We are very happy, proud, and privileged to have Pallavi Aiyar as our guest today. And some of us on Sundays, we seem to consume the magazine section of the newspaper well before we even turn to what is considered the main paper. And I have never ever missed Pallavi Aiyar's chiseled, evocative columns. In fact, it is those columns that have led me to her priceless books. I'm very delighted also to share with you the happy news that her latest book, Orienting an Indian in Japan, has been shortlisted for the JK Paper Times of India Award, Best Author Non-Fiction Award. Congratulations, Pallavi, and all the very best. We are all excited. This announcement came just yesterday, and we should congratulate ourselves for choosing the right person at the right time. Pallavi Aiyar's books on China and Japan are of particular interest to SCILET, mainly because we are very eager to get to know about our neighbors and also their literatures. SCILET, in fact, has been building little alcoves of Asian literatures to help our students understand and read Indian literature in the Asian context. And Pallavi Aiyar has often been labeled an Asianist, a travel writer, a journalist, a culture critic, a political analyst, a fiction writer, a memoirist, an environmental writer, etc., etc. These different labels and identities attributed to her and the different honors and awards that she has received from time to time, they seem to carry the adjective global. In fact, she is even referred to as a globalist, as a globalizer, but she is certainly not a selfie-obsessed globetrotter. Whatever may be the subject that she chooses to write on, and whatever genre that she adopts, Pallavi Aiyar has the readers hooked, totally engaged. She is primarily a storyteller. She has a way of transforming the material and her insights into narratives that speak to the heart. In fact, humor is her huge strength. Whether she writes on China, Japan, Indonesia, or Europe, there is never a I know it all tone. In fact, Pallavi Aiyar has a way of laughing at her own inadequacies. Writing for her is a way of re-examining her impressions, clarifying her views. In short, writing is part of her learning process. And in spite of all the attempts that we make at understanding and appreciating other cultures, cultures can remain inscrutable. Cultures can remain opaque and therefore very alluring, inviting newer attempts at interpretation. Pallavi Aiyar makes sure that the reader's fascination for the cultures that she writes about, that fascination remains intact. In fact, her writing seems to encourage us to ask more and more questions. The inherent contradictions in these cultures, that seems to intrigue us. And the way silence is being treated as, used, manipulated, and even revered, that seems to amuse us. Dalai Lama once remarked that in the Chinese parliament, there is too much silence. And in the Indian parliament, there is too much noise. And the senior journalist, Jag Saraya, therefore called India the largest and the loudest democracy. But in China, in Japan, we see that silence is a prized virtue. Japan is known for its incredible fidelity to silence, reverence for silence. Pallavi Aiyar has enhanced our understanding and appreciation for this Japanese silence. In fact, Pallavi Aiyar has also enhanced our vocabulary, enriched our vocabulary with the choicest Japanese words with great sound effects. Kikikomori and wabi-sabi are my favorites. And these words have gained enormous currency in our daily conversations and our group discussions. Arigato, Pallavi Aiyar. This word arigato kept staring at us from the Tokyo Olympics stadium and has remained with us. Arigato gozaimasu. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Now I invite Pavitra Devi and David Jairaj to introduce SCILET and the program to us through their 3.5-minute video. Pallavi, may I now request you to make the presentation?
Yes, of course. Wow, what a welcome, Premila. I have to say that your introduction is by far, I think, my favorite that's ever been done. And you should really be, I mean, possibly you are a cultural critic yourself, because I can see that you're such a close reader and such a thoughtful, nuanced and sort of sensitive reader, just in terms of how you're able to describe what I've been doing, and in many ways, describe it better than I think I could have done. So that was really wonderful to hear. And thank you also to SCILET for doing that amazing video. It's really an honor to be asked to speak to the students here and to be present, albeit only virtually. But technology is a double-edged sword, and while it cannot really replace being there in person, at least it allows me to be there and to be able to speak to all of you today, which is something I'm greatly looking forward to, particularly to taking questions and answers later on in the session. You asked me to talk about my work, my life as it were, in reporting, in journalism, in writing. And so I was just thinking a little bit about it this morning. And the first thing that struck me is how we don't often sort of deconstruct or question our identity. It's rare that we sort of sit down to really think about ourselves. And that made me think about, how I would classify, what kind of taxonomy I would come up with for my identity. And it also helped me realize what multitudes all of us contain within us. Like if we were, all of us as an exercise, sit down and try to understand who we are, it would be very interesting to come up with what classification of identity we would devise. And just to start off, I thought I would list this very off-the-cuff list that I came up with. So in descending order of importance, this is how I would describe myself. As a mother, a writer, a reader, a friend, an Indian, a learner, a pluralist, a woman, a traveler, and an English speaker. I have no idea why I picked these in particular, but these are what came to my mind. And I think that's an interesting exercise for all of us to do. Go back to our origins, sort of think about how we think about ourselves. As Premila mentioned in her introduction, or sorry, I think it was in the movie, my background is that of a family of writers and media personalities. My mother, Geetanjali Aiyar, was one of the first television news anchors for Doordarshan, starting from the late 1970s. And my father, Swaminathan Iyer, is an economist and a journalist who has been a columnist with the Times of India for the last 30 years, writing a column called Swanomics every Sunday. So I really grew up surrounded by books, surrounded by discussions that had to do with world affairs, with politics in India, with trying to understand the particular nature of our country, which is such an interesting and unusual amalgamation of cultures, of languages, of foods. And I think that I basically took that curiosity that I had developed at a very early age and then expanded it beyond India to the world, which kind of tends to explain how my oeuvre of writing, and I can see all the various books lined up behind Premila, but how they end up being in many ways quite diverse. And it's quite hard to sort of categorize me as either a political writer or a cultural writer or a memoirist or a fiction writer, because I really have ranged widely across genres. But I think that's also just one part of my attempt and my identity of being somebody who spans boundaries and who crosses borders, be it in genres of writing or just be it in terms of curiosity about the world. I grew up thinking that what I really wanted to do with my life was to be a television reporter. This is the idea I had when I was in school. And I think partly the reason was that I was in high school in the early 1990s when the Indian media landscape was undergoing huge, tremendous tectonic really changes because we were going from this one channel, very staid, Doordarshan, with its emphasis on sort of public broadcasting, but very government-heavy news, to a privatized landscape of satellite and cable television, where we had an explosion of hundreds of channels, and we suddenly had the possibility of private news channels that were actually going out there and showing what was happening as it was unfolding. So when I graduated from university, I studied philosophy in Delhi University, and then I studied in the UK where I did history. When I returned to India, I decided to apply for a job in television, which was really burgeoning. This was in the late 1990s. And my first job was as an on-camera reporter for NDTV, which at the time actually was producing all the content for Star News. So it was not even called, there was no channel called NDTV. We were a production house. And straight away, as a 22-year-old, there I was in the newsrooms, reporting on all manner of things, from earthquakes to droughts to day-to-day political developments to environmental stories, a very wide, broad, genre-spanning series of stories. But I think I realized that I was not particularly enamored of the medium of television. And there were various reasons for this. One was that I think it was primarily a visual medium. And I think what I was really interested in was words. And words in television are secondary. You let the picture tell the story, and the words are the supporting cast of characters. And I realized that what I loved really were being able to paint that picture with words rather than just having a camera tell that story. And the other, of course, was that there were very, very strong limitations on the duration of the stories. Most television stories were about a minute to a minute and a half. So this was again something that made me feel like we couldn't go in depth to really get at nuances, because from a very early age, I think I was grasping at the idea that and that in fact truth is very multiple, that it's very varied, and that it's very nuanced. And this was something that television was not suited to, at least in the news format, in conveying. So I did what many young people do, which is I decided to study a bit further to figure out what it was that I really wanted to do. And I went to do a master's program in London. And, that's when many things happened that came together that I think ended up deciding the course of my future life. And I think for all of you, young people also, you will see that life is a combination of decisions that you take, your appetite for risk, and then ultimately serendipity or luck. When the stars kind of align. So while I was in London studying, I met the person who was to go on to become my husband. And he happened to come from Spain. And he also happened to have been a student of Chinese when he was an undergraduate. And this was back in the year 2000, when, for an Indian, China was not something that loomed that large on the imagination. We grew up, I went to an English medium school. The literature we read was really primarily from the West. The movies I watched were really primarily from the West. And so one's imagination was very much sort of oriented towards Europe and the US, and all these huge countries that were really bordering us, sitting next to us, were largely absent from one's mental map, which just goes to show how there is not always a clear-cut overlap between a mental map and the geographic map. If one was to go by the geographic map, places like China and Japan should have been much more important than faraway places like the United States of America, but that was not the case. But meeting Julio, my then boyfriend, who went on to become my husband, I began to think about China for the first time seriously. And I visited Beijing, where he had gone to do an internship in 2001 for the first time. And this was the year that China entered the World Trade Organization. It was the year that it won, that Beijing won the bid to host the 2008 Olympic Games. And suddenly, you know, China, it was kind of like a coming out party for this giant that Napoleon famously had said, you know, was a dragon that was sleeping. But once it would awake, the whole world would tremble. And you could actually see the beginnings of those tremors of the dragon waking up. And I remember driving into the city from the airport in Beijing and just being blown away by the dynamism. And, you know, you looked out of your windows and it was almost as though these skyscrapers were being vomited out, were being sort of erupting from the earth. And there was something that was going on there that had an energy that was so vast that even to the first time visitor who didn't know very much about the country, it was evident that there was seismic shifts that would have global importance going forward. It really felt like a moment in history where if you were there, lucky enough to be there, you would tell your grandchildren about it, that, you know, I was there when. So, you know, the rest is living in China for the next 8 years. And my first child, Ishan, was born in Beijing later on in 2008. And during this time, I worked variously as the China correspondent for the Indian Express and later as the bureau chief for the Hindu. And I was able to travel the length and breadth of the country and visited about 26 of its 30 plus provinces. I learned to speak Chinese, and I lived quite a local life in a very sort of local neighborhood. So it was not a kind of expat life, which many foreigners end up living when they visit foreign countries. This was also a time before the current administration of Xi Jinping, which has tended towards closing the country down and isolating it in many ways, including by censoring the internet and so on. But when I was there, the political trajectory was very much, sort of towards on the up and opening. And on many days, it would feel as though, you know, we were in the Tower of Babel. I mean, because it was attracting adventurers and enthusiasts from all over the world. So cities like Beijing and Shanghai were really magnets for people who wanted to be part of this story. And at that time, at least, China was welcoming and quite open of foreigners because they were hungry to learn from all over the world. So it was quite an interesting time. And, you know, India and China together made up, a third of the world's population. And we still had only 2 foreign correspondents from India that were covering this huge story. So it was kind of virgin territory. People were not there. Indians were not there writing about it. So for me, it was a great privilege and responsibility to kind of be a Chinese-speaking Indian voice in Beijing, who's traveling and being able to bring these stories to India. And it was very important. And I think it helped me right from the word. I mean, in the future, I went on to report from many other countries. But China was a very formative experience because it made me realize how important an Asian lens, how important an Indian lens is to covering foreign countries. we as a nation in India are used to mostly consuming our news about the world, and therefore understanding both the world and our Indian place in that world from a very lopsided lens, because we tend to read about it through foreign media. We tend to read about it through either American media or through wire agencies like Reuters and so on. But I think being in China as an Indian, really almost every day I was struck by how I was seeing things very differently from my Western colleagues. And I'll give you an example, of how we would perhaps see the same fact, but come up with entirely different observations about that fact. And it's as simple as the traffic in Beijing. The traffic in Beijing to an Indian seemed remarkably orderly. The traffic in Beijing to a German seemed remarkably chaotic. We would look at the same thing, the traffic, but if we were to write about it, we would come up with dramatically opposite conclusions. So just something as simple as this, I think, helps to illuminate how important your implicit lenses are. Because as a human being, all of us, when we look at something, we interpret what we are looking at against our implicit norms. And if your implicit norm is the traffic in Bangalore or Delhi or Bombay, or if your implicit norm is the traffic in Frankfurt or Munich or Berlin, you are going to look at the fact of traffic in Beijing in a completely different way. So during the course of my time in China, I also realized that as a reporter, even though in print media, you often have a lot more space to delve into deeper stories. You can do long reads and so on. So it's deeper than, say, television as the medium. But even then, it obviously has space constraints. And for every story that I would report, I would have notebooks filled with field notes, with research, and only a fraction of that would make it into these newspaper reports. So that's when I began to think about how I could write a book, my first book perhaps, drawing upon all of these experiences that I had collected over a 5 or 6 year period, the dramatic transformations that China was undergoing, and seeing these through an Indian perspective and through a human-centered perspective. Because all too often when we talk about foreign countries, we are talking about geopolitics, or we are talking about business, but we are not talking about people. And ultimately, I think the more you travel, the more you realize how people everywhere are fundamentally just human beings, and we have remarkably similar concerns. And I think it becomes very important when we are talking about elsewhere to talk about the human dimension, because it becomes very easy otherwise to other them and just reduce them to statistics of various kinds, whether it is GDP development or the amount of expenditure that they are doing on defense, or whatever the current trope might be. So I wrote Smoke and Mirrors, which was my first book. Let me find it over here. There we are. And this was published in 2008, and it did quite well. And I think that it showed that there was actually a hunger in India for books like that and for perspectives like that, because despite us being a country of 1.3 billion people with a very large diaspora, I think when it comes to writing about the world, to sort of cataloging it, the sort of production of knowledge about the world and then the distribution of that knowledge has very much been a Western preserve. And it's not been that, Indians who are writing even on an international stage are often writing about India. It's quite rare for Indians to be writing about other parts of the world. And I think that there was a space for that and a hunger for that, and that continues to be there. and continues to actually remain largely unaddressed. It's still a largely empty field, I think, when it comes to Indians writing about the rest of the world, but in a way that's universal. Why should an American be able to write about China and all of us in India be reading those books? Even though it is written very clearly from an American perspective, why does that American perspective become universal? Why should an Indian perspective not be equally of interest universally? So I think that's another question I would like all of you to think about. But anyway, going back to the chronology of my evolution as a writer and a journalist, just as Smoke and Mirrors, my first book, came out, I also had my first son, my first child, Ishan, who was born just about during the Olympics, the 2008 Beijing Olympics. And prior to having children, Julio and I had decided to adopt 2 Chinese street cats as kind of a dress rehearsal for the real thing. We were not sure that we would be good and capable parents, and we thought that maybe taking the plunge into parenthood right off the bat might be a step too far. And so as this dress rehearsal, we put up a notice at the local vet in Beijing saying that we were interested in adopting cats. And this also opened up, whole new vistas to us. We got to know, about rogue vets, about cat protection societies, about old aunties who were cat mad, about people who hated cats because they thought that they were virus carriers, about people who loved cats because they thought that they channeled the divine. I mean, there's this whole subculture around pets, I think, usually in different parts of the world. And we got exposed to this through this process of adopting 2 cats. And when my son was born and I was on maternity leave at home, I was, I've sort of spent quite a lot of time wondering how the cats were receiving this change in their circumstance, because suddenly they went from being the sort of pampered, adored babies of the family to being second-class citizens who were always being told to be quiet because the baby is sleeping. And I think that's what first sparked my interest in just sort of thinking about the cat's thoughts and how perhaps they see this world, and what that might help us as human beings, if we don't center human beings but put us on the side and we center outsiders like animals looking in, how society might kind of come across to them. And so I ended up writing my first work of fiction, which was called Chinese Whiskers, a pun, of course, on Chinese whispers, which had the 2 cats that I have, Soybean and Tofu, as protagonists. And I tried to sort of give us a feeling of important things that were going on in China and in Beijing, but a cat's-eye view of them. So the book also deals with some pretty, naughty universal issues like the clash between tradition and modernity, and how the change in, physical spaces or architectural spaces affect social relations, in sort of moral anomy and, cultural displacement when a society is undergoing rapid material transformation, the kind of corruption that results from that, but told from the point of view of almost like a children's story, like a fable, operating as a fable. And so we had the birth of Chinese Whiskers. And it was around this time that my husband sat the civil service exams for the European Union civil service. And so after 8 years in China, we ended up moving to Brussels in Belgium, which is the headquarters of the European Union. And it was a dramatic change. We went from this huge, big, dynamic 24/7, megalopolis to a tiny 1 million, almost sleepy town in Europe. But, drama seems to follow me everywhere I go. And even though we were in Brussels, we landed just before the great Euro crisis of 2010, when there was a big default by Greece. And as a result, we suddenly had the European Union facing imminent collapse and asking very important existential questions about itself. And also, I think being an Indian, looking at the EU, looking at the European Union was very interesting, because what the EU was trying to do was, I think, what India had in many ways already achieved, which was to stitch a united tapestry out of this very diverse, pluralistic set of cultures, languages, and traditions. In many ways, Kashmiris and Keralites have as much in common as, people from Finland and Greece. And so I actually thought that we in India were quite an interesting prototype for Europe. And being in Europe at the time made me think a lot about issues of pluralism, about also Islam, because I think one of the big issues or challenges that Europe was facing was large numbers of immigrants from Islamic countries, which was causing tension in many of the cities where you now had a majority Muslim population, or if not majority, a substantial Muslim population. Cities like Brussels, where I lived, about 30% of the population today is Muslim. And that itself was, leading to very interesting dynamics about majorities and minorities. And again, a lot of these things that we in India were also had traditionally tussled with and continue to tussle with. So I ended up writing a book about that experience called Punjabi Parmesan, Dispatches from a Europe in Crisis. And I called it Punjabi Parmesan because I was also looking at different immigrant communities, mostly Chinese and Indian, that were moving to Europe and really, reworking it in many interesting ways. And one of these communities was of Punjabi agricultural laborers who, particularly in Italy, had become the main source of agricultural labor, which was something that was very unknown. I mean, you thought about Indian diaspora in the UK, perhaps, but not hidden in the countryside of Italy. But if you went in there, you would see that most of the dairy production, for example, in Italy, including the making of the famous Parmesan cheese, was actually being done by these Punjabi agricultural laborers, hence the term Punjabi Parmesan. So we ended up being in Brussels for about 3.5 years, and my second son, Nicolas, was born in Brussels, after which my husband got a posting in another fascinating country, Indonesia, and we were in Jakarta for the next 4 years. And Jakarta really, I think, is the most under-recognized important country in the world. It is huge. It's got one of the biggest populations, not compared to India, but compared to other countries, 260 million people, 17,000 islands, a huge amount of diversity, linguistic and also religious. It is the biggest Muslim majority country in the world, with about 86% of its population identifying as Muslim, but it has significant minorities of Christians, Hindus, and so on, Confucians as well. And it is a democracy, which was not that common in the Muslim world. And I actually felt that the parallels between Indonesia and India were more enriching and more helpful to understand India than often the parallels made between China and India, which in some ways were like comparing apples and oranges. But I think Indonesia and India had a lot of likeness and resonance. And so it was a very, very interesting experience to be able to explore something like, it was a country that was like a civilizational cousin, if I might put it like that. While I was there, the book I ended up writing was Babies and Bylines, because I was also the mother at this point of time of 2 boys under the age of 5, which presented its own set of challenges and made me think very deeply about family structures, about feminism, about the writing life, about motherhood, about identity. For example, my children, who were half Spanish, half Indian, and one had been born in China, one had been born in Brussels, and they were now growing up in Indonesia. Like, what does this mean for identity? So all of these issues were sort of topmost in my mind, and I spent quite a lot of time exploring them in this book, Babies and Bylines. And it was also in Indonesia that I did my monograph on air pollution, because unfortunately, I also seem to have spent most of my life living in very polluted cities. I had grown up in Delhi. I'd spent 8 years in Beijing. Jakarta's air was not exactly clean either. And I ended up doing a monograph comparing the challenges and the strategies used to combat dirty air in Beijing, and then looking at Delhi. Because this was about the time when Beijing, which had for long been the poster boy, the international poster boy of air pollution, was actually improving its air quality, just as we were realizing how bad it was in Delhi. So I did a quick monograph on that. And as that finished, we moved to Tokyo, to Japan, which is where the last book I wrote, Orienting, an Indian in Japan, was set. But while I was in Japan, I actually ended up doing 3 books. We have here 1,000 Cranes for India, which is an anthology, and I'll tell you about it shortly. And Jakarta Tales, which was the sequel to Chinese Whiskers, the continuing adventures of soybean and tofu. So Jakarta Tales took the cats from Beijing and situated them in Indonesia, in Jakarta. And in Chinese Whiskers, the plot line had been thus. One of the cats, Soybean, who's a very beautiful and good-looking cat, gets a job offer to be a cat model for a new brand of pet food. And the other cat, Tofu, gets kidnapped by a gang of vigilantes because there is a mysterious virus. This is long before COVID, by the way, so it's quite prescient. It was based on the 2003 SARS virus, coronavirus 1.0, which happened when I lived in Beijing. And even then, when SARS was spreading in China, there were rumors that the cats and dogs were responsible for spreading this virus. So you had vigilante gangs that would round up stray cats and stray dogs from the streets and take them off to an unsavory end. So in my novel, I sort of also use that. And Tofu gets kidnapped by one of these vigilante gangs, but ends up escaping and living for a while with migrant workers who are building the Olympic Games stadium. And in the meantime, we discover that the pet food that Caramel is modeling for is a contaminated brand of pet food, where the boss is actually adding contaminants like melamine in it to boost the protein content artificially. So, these are all strands of migrant workers and injustices and corruption and contamination and viruses and vigilantism, all these different things that are going on. So that was what Chinese Whiskers was about. In Jakarta Tales, I sort of set it in a society which is a very pluralistic society in terms of religion, but which is becoming more and more polarized. And in particular, the use of social media in spreading fake news. So in Jakarta Tales, the cats get embroiled in another adventure, but this time it is with the neighbors of their owners, and the neighbors are running this fake news factory from their house, and the cats get embroiled in that during a presidential election in Indonesia. So that was Jakarta Tales. A very different book was 1,000 Cranes for India, which is actually an anthology of writers from India, poets, memoirists, journalists, short story writers. And I got them all to write about the different fault lines in India, from class to caste to religion. But in each of the pieces, you have the Japanese paper crane as a kind of Easter egg that is hidden and connects all the pieces. And the reason is that I got inspired to do this anthology while I was in the city of Hiroshima, which had been destroyed by the atomic bomb in 1945. And there's a story in Japan that one of a girl, Sadako Sasaki, who was affected by the radiation and ended up dying of it many years later, was in hospital folding paper cranes, because there's a legend that if you fold 1,000 paper cranes, then your wishes come true. And so she was folding trying to fold 1,000 paper cranes to save her life, but she died. And then that cause was taken up by school children across Japan, and they ended up completing the 1,000 paper cranes for her. And ever since then, it's become a symbol of reclamation and of hope in Japan. And while I was in Hiroshima learning this story, I heard about the brutal rape and murder in Kashmir of this 8-year-old girl, Asifa Banu. This was in 2018. And I was really heartbroken by the fact that these kinds of things were happening in my country on my watch, which is why I launched this project of 1,000 paper cranes for India and did this anthology. And then, of course, as we were wrapping up our time in Japan in 2020, the pandemic had already started, but I decided to try to do a book along the lines of Smoke and Mirrors, which was to introduce this country to an Indian readership, looking at it thematically and gathering all the research that I had got by being a reporter over the last 4 years. And the result was orienting an Indian in Japan. And by thematic, I mean that, like if you look at the various chapter headings, they are like breaking and healing, seasonal flavors, which is about the 4 seasons in Japan as a theme, Waterloo, which is about how learning Japanese was my linguistic Waterloo, but it's basically about the language, Japanese language, and what that tells us about the country. No foreigners, please, we are Japanese. This is about racism in Japan, because we often think that racism is about is something that happens in Western countries, but no, I mean, as we know, it happens in India and it also happens in Japan. Massaging the Octopus, which is about food, specifically Japanese food culture. Chapter 7 is called From Japan, We Want to Wash the Whole World's Bottom. And this is actually a haiku that was a winning entry in a competition that was launched by a toilet maker called Toto in Japan. But the chapter is about cleanliness more generally, about cleanliness as a theme in Japan. And then there's one called Monks, Movie Stars, Revolutionaries, Elephants, which is about the various multifaceted connections that India and Japan have had, dating back to Buddhism and monks that had traveled from India to Japan and were very important in establishing some of the most seminal sects of Japanese Buddhism, to movie stars like Rajnikant in the present era, to revolutionaries like Bose, not only Netaji, but also Rash Bihari Bose, who's another very interesting character that I go into in detail. And anyway, in sum, here we have orienting an Indian in Japan. And then I most recently moved to Spain about 1.5 years ago, where I have been writing a weekly blog called The Global Jigsaw, which is trying to put all of these various strands together and make sense of the world, and all the connections that we have, which is, I think, the entire body of my work has been trying to do for the last 20 years. I'm looking at the time and realizing that we are running out of it. So I think it might be a good time to break for some question and answers. And I would love to have responses from those of you who've had the opportunity to read some of my work, but also any kind of questions about writing, reporting, living in other parts of the world, being an Indian in the world, as it were. So how do we do this?
Thank you so much, ma'am. This is Joel.
Yes, Joel, hi.
Thank you so much for your interesting and inspirational talk on your life and your experience, your career. We enjoyed reading your books, particularly Orienting an Indian in Japan. So thank you. We will have Q&A now. We will call your names. Those of you who have posted your questions in the chat room, we'll call your names. Please unmute and switch on the video and ask your question. So first question is, it's by Madhav. Madhav, can you unmute?
Question is, what compromises did you have to make while living in China to write about China? That's my question.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting question. So I was surprised by how open people were. Now, I think that when I say people, I need to make a clear distinction between officialdom in China and between just, people who were neighbors, people on the streets, and also often academics and other experts that one might meet. And I have to say that when it came to officialdom in China, there was a very sort of censored, standard reply on everything that you would get. And these were the least interesting people as a result to speak to. So to speak to somebody, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or anything like that, I could predict what the answers were going to be well in advance. I mean, there was almost no need to actually go to interview them because you knew what they were going to say. You could have just written the identical script, as it were. But I think with people who you got to know in the normal course of things, the fact that I had learned Chinese made a huge difference in encouraging them to open up. And in fact, contrary to, I think, a lot of expectations that Chinese were like robots whose thoughts were completely controlled and so on, I thought that they were very independent minded and quite open and critical about a lot of things that were going on, while at the same time quite appreciative of a lot of the changes that had gone on as well. Because the fact was that, in China, we were seeing a lot of improvements in the lives of ordinary people. So while there were restrictions, certain restrictions on for example, what on say demonstrations or strikes, that was something that people could be quite critical about, but they were quite open about it. I personally found that because I was writing for Indian newspapers, there was no sort of censorship on the government level. The only time I really ran into trouble was in about 2008, just before the Olympic Games were launched. And I was doing a story which was a fluff story on how there was this big Olympic clock in the center of the city in Tiananmen Square, and it was counting down the days to the games. And I think it was like 100 days left for the games. So I basically went to Tiananmen Square to take some pictures of the clock that had 100 days left and do a few interviews with people, tourists, Chinese domestic tourists who were around there, to ask them about how excited they were about the games. And while I was doing those interviews, I suddenly got detained by people in plain clothes who turned out to be people from the National Security Bureau, who are planted all over Tiananmen Square, precisely on the lookout for people asking questions or acting in a manner that is maybe not authorized. And they took me aside and kept me waiting for 6 hours while they investigated my claims that I was a journalist and that I was indeed a journalist. And not only me, but also the poor person who I happened to ask a question of was detained. We were taken to separate rooms. We were asked to say, what were you discussing, and to see whether our stories matched and so on. And the problem was that I was not carrying my journalist card with me at the time, which you are technically supposed to do. But this ended up landing me in a 6-hour-long detention, and it ended with me having to write a self-criticism, which is a very Chinese Communist Party tactic, in which you have to actually write a long letter criticizing yourself, saying, I'm very sorry, I broke the rules, I didn't carry my journalist card, and I will never do it again. And eventually I was let off, and the story was actually carried, and so on. But in China, there were many rules like that were not really observed, but then occasionally, if you broke that rule, they could come down on you. So I think many of the rules functioned like that, as something to trap you at a point when you crossed a certain line, rather than something that you were aware of on a daily basis. But yeah, I think the biggest challenge in reporting in any country, and China was no exception, was really linguistic. It's about learning the language.
Ma'am, I think Dr. Geeta is ready. Geeta Kanagaraj?
Yes, Joe. Thank you, Joe. As Pallavi, it was a pleasure listening to you. Quite an experience. I have two questions for you. The first one is, Japan is known for its reverence for hard work. They work themselves to death. Is this a typical Japanese tendency, or is it to do with something to do with a compulsion to rebuild the nation after disaster struck? Am I
So
audible?
I think you are. So can I address that question first?
Yes, yes, Ms. Pallavi.
I think that it's interesting that you ask about this idea of rebuilding the country, because of course that is an important, the spirit of rebuilding has infused a lot of post-war Japan and is very important. But, many other countries were also destroyed during the Second World War, badly affected by it. And you haven't seen the same kind of reverence for work that is inbuilt in Japan. And I think that predates the world wars. As you very rightly said, that people not only work hard, they work themselves to death, literally. And you have a word in Japanese called karoshi, which means death by overwork. And every year there's like 300-400 people who are designated as having died by karoshi, by just having sat in the office and not left till they were dehydrated, or occasionally got a heart attack or got a stroke. It's a very deep problem. And I think it's got to do with many things, with a huge reverence for hierarchy. So that basically people don't feel comfortable leaving their work environment until the person above them in that hierarchy has left. That person above them is not comfortable leaving before the person above them has left, and so on. It kind of builds. And there is this huge valorization of hard work, and of sort of suppressing your individual needs for the larger good. And that larger good might just be the neighborhood, it might be your family, or it might be the office in the case of many salarymen, the company, and everything that matters to the company precedes your own individual needs, whether it's your health, your hunger, your thirst. And I think this is one of the most negative aspects of Japanese societies today, because it also goes against sort of the whole idea of working smartly, working as much as you need to, and the idea that work-life balance actually leads to more productive human beings. And I think if you look at the Japanese economy, you see that it's very stagnant, and that a lot of these sort of big companies have not been able to make the transition, the digital transition that we've seen in many other countries. And absolutely, I think this kind of reverence for overwork is partly to blame.
Now I ask the second question. Thank you, Ms. Pallavi. The second question, as a travel writer, you have recorded your impressions about the culture of a place in your books. Have you ever felt like revising it?
All the time. I think not knowing things is my speciality, and it is also my badge of honor. I often call myself the anti-guru. I'm not about telling you how things are. I'm sort of trying to understand how they are. And when you are trying to understand something, you make mistakes. And it's almost like a very foolhardy thing to do. To write a country is something that's almost inevitably going to be wrong, because all places are contradictory. And everything you can say about some place is usually true and not true at the same time. So it is very hard to kind of make these general observations. You feel like you're helicoptering into somewhere, seeing a few things and writing about it. And I'm very aware of the hubris of that. And I try to get around it by, not only making it about the places I'm writing it about, but also about myself. It is a kind of introspective journey where I'm also deconstructing why I think the way I think, why I come to the conclusions that I come to. Because I think that what I write about a place has as much to do with that place as it has to do with me as the observer, including my own limitations. So yeah, I have revised my opinion. And it's a continuous journey of learning and unlearning, just being in the world, I think.
Thank you, Ms. Pallavi.
Oh, Vinchila.
Yes, sir. Hello, ma'am. How will you explain the enthusiasm for Indian films among the Japanese and Chinese?
So I think because in their normal lives, Japanese people are very inward and sort of, restricting of a display of emotions. And it's almost like a badge of honor that they have. I have a Japanese friend, for example, who is married to a Korean woman, and he was trying to explain to me the difference between Koreans and Japanese. And he said, Koreans, they're really emotional people, unlike us Japanese. And if you go to a funeral in Korea, like everybody is like, oh, crying. But in Japan, when we are at a funeral, we are like, it's kind of like stuffing back the grief that you might have inwards. And as a result, I think something about the zaniness and craziness and technicolored madness of Indian movies is liberating and helps in some ways to enact something on screen which they obviously cannot do in their real lives. And when I also do not want to over exaggerate the popularity of Indian movies. If you were to go to Japan, a person on the streets is far more likely to recognize the name of, say, Brad Pitt than they are to recognize the name of Rajnikant, who is the person that I write about in the movie, in the book. The thing is that in Japan, there is also a tendency to have groups of people who become really passionate and enthusiastic about quite a narrow area. And you can find people who are crazy about stamp collecting or crazy about manhole cover designs. You also have enthusiasts of Rajnikant. Now, if you look at the entire population of Japan, 170 million people, and then you look at the number of people in the Rajnikant fan club, maybe 4,000, 5,000 people, it's not that many. What's interesting is that these 4,000, 5,000 people are probably the most passionate fans of Rajnikant that you can find anywhere in the world, where they will dress like him, where they will talk like him, where they will learn Tamil if necessary to understand the movies better, visit Tamil. Rajnikant has never actually visited Japan. So these people normally go to Chennai or somewhere to watch the premieres of his movies. They have imported auto rickshaws from Tamil Nadu into Tokyo and ride around the streets on them. So, you've got this subculture of really passionate enthusiasts. And I think this Rajnikant obsession, the Rajnikant fan club is one example of that. So it's not a huge and widely spread popularity of, say, the kind that Hollywood movies enjoy. It's more of a niche. It's more of a niche. And I think for the people who are attracted to that, it's that sort of liberating aspect, which is so different from a buttoned up existence in Japan, that is appealing.
Thank you, ma'am.
Adhiyaman?
Hi, ma'am.
Hi.
Hi, ma'am. So my question is, due to overwork, as you mentioned, Karoshi culture and social recluse, the social life seems limited in Japan. So in this context, what is more common in Japan? Do love marriage or arranged marriage?
So traditionally, the Japanese had arranged marriages, like was the case in, I think, much of Asia. And you had matchmakers that basically helped parents to arrange matches. There's a wonderful novel called The Makioka Sisters, which is a bit like a Japanese Pride and Prejudice. I think it's better than Pride and Prejudice, actually, which talks about the changes it looks at three sisters and their marriage prospects, and it's set during the World War years. Very, very fascinating read as well. But as society has changed, the role of the matchmaker has more or less disappeared. And I would say the vast, vast majority of marriages are love marriages. But I think that, love marriages in the sort of romantic Western sense is also possibly exaggerated, because I think people tend to be quite practical. And it's so the idea is not just falling in love, but finding somebody that you think would make a solid spouse. So sort of a lot of practical considerations that people take into account. So it's a very expensive, like Japan is a very expensive country. Tokyo is a very expensive city. So people have to kind of figure out if this is somebody that can, that they can sort of financially make a life with. And more we're seeing that people are not getting married. There's a very strong trend in Japan for women who just don't want to get married because it continues to be such a patriarchal society, and the financial structure is such that it's very hard for women to continue to work after getting married and having children, and many of them would rather focus on their careers. And so we're seeing a major trend towards basically singlehood, and more women in their 30s today are not married. So that's also interesting.
Thank you, ma'am. Next is Rania.
Hello, ma'am. It's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Rania, and
Hi.
I just wanted to know what sort of cultural impact does anime have on Japan, since anime is a booming culture nowadays.
So anime, is something that I'm personally not very interested in. So I don't explore it in great detail in the book, but it's one of the major ways in which Japan influences the world, right? It's like the major plank of Japanese soft culture, soft power out there. And I see it in like everywhere. When I was in Indonesia, anime was huge. In Madrid, in Spain, manga and anime is huge amongst young people. It's again one of the sort of subcultures in Japan, and it's a very large subculture. And on a Sunday afternoon in places like Harajuku in Tokyo, you have a lot of cosplay where people dress up as anime characters and walk around. It's something that they realize as part of their cultural capital, and so it's used in international fora by the government as well. For example, when there was the bid for Tokyo to win the Olympic Games, there was anime characters that were used as part of the celebrations once the games were won by Tokyo. So it's an important sort of subculture in Japan, and I think it's also co-opted by the foreign policy establishment quite wisely as one way of projecting Japanese influence globally. But I think Japan basically struggles with that it has a very positive image abroad in many ways. It's not seen as aggressive military power because it has eschewed military power, and instead it is seen as the land of sakura, by young people as the land of anime, by connoisseurs of whiskey as the land of artisanal whiskey, and so on. It has a lot of soft power, but the challenge for Japan is translating that soft power into having sort of a greater geostrategic role in the world. And I think that's something that they're working on. But the flip side of the anime culture in Japan is the development of otakus, right? Who are supposed to be these kind of nerdy geeks who, in a very extreme version, become hikikomori. So you start off as an otaku who's very passionate about anime, and then you graduate slowly to a situation where you gradually cut off contact with the rest of the world and become somebody who's hiding away in your parents' house in a room dependent on them for all your basic needs and unable to actually function in society. So there's also some worry within the sort of psychologist communities that it's a slippery slope between somebody who is an otaku passionate about anime and sort of becoming eventually a hikikimori. Considering that you have over 1 million hikikimoris in the country, you can understand why that might be a concern.
Tamara Selvi, your question.
Ma'am, why have Ikigai books become international booksellers, and how do the Japanese understand the concept of Ikigai?
So, Ikigai is like a very popular concept, as you said. And I think it's part and parcel of this whole attempt to look at Japanese culture by corporate gurus and make it into like a self-help industry. So we also have Marie Kondo, for example, about how to tidy up your closets. You have Ikigai about how to find happiness. Personally, I find that quite hilarious because Japanese are amongst the most unhappy people that you would find in the world. Like if you were to do a a survey, as they do global happiness indexes and all of that, the Japanese come consistently amongst the lowest because, life is very expensive, houses are very small, there's death by overwork, there's all of these things that are going on because it's a very high pressure society. And yet we have this persistent orientalization that somehow there's Eastern wisdom. I think it's this whole idea of Buddhism, Hinduism, Eastern wisdom that sort of has something to teach the West about something that's beyond materialism, right? Ikigai is about trying to find this perfect consonance between what you do and what your passions really are. To find, if you were to have a Venn diagram, it's to find the interlinking part of that Venn diagram. So I think, it feeds into this industry, which has basically aestheticized Japanese society for a very long time, for the last 50 or 60 years. And just because it has a fancy name, which is unfamiliar to English speakers, Ikigai, just to say that do what you are passionate about. I mean, it basically sort of boils down to that. You can spin off a lot of books about it. But that said, it's true that in Japan, you do have the shokunin or the artisan who is essentially really focused on not the sort of accolades or the appreciation that you get from the job that you are doing, but just from doing that job and deriving pleasure from doing that job. So that the goal is not something that happens after doing that job, but from doing it. And in some ways, of course, that's also very close to our own concept in India of dharma and, doing your duty rather than thinking about what the fruits of those duties are going to be. And I think that, global happiness experts have discovered that the more we focus on doing our job and the less we focus on the eventual success or failures, mindfulness, in other words, it helps us as human beings. So these are concepts that have been around for a very long time and are there in many cultures. But there is a fashion, a global fashion, I think, for Eastern wisdom, and in particular, it's a nifty word that sort of summarizes these.
Thank you, ma'am.
Glenn Chatlia, can you ask your question?
Yes, I do not know if I'm audible enough, but I'm joining you from Assumption University of Thailand, and I commend you on your very interesting and wide-ranging, views on the cross-cultural experience. My question to you is regarding the transference of Indian values that you may have detected in the various cultures that you either resided in or traveled within, given that the Indian diaspora pre-1947 and post-1947 has been pretty much, well established by now. I just wondered if you were able to detect any of the comparisons or let's say the contrasts of the Indian culture in any of these cultures. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Glenn. I think that in most of the countries I've lived in Asia, the Indian diaspora has not been a significant force. In China, for example, in mainland China, Hong Kong being the exception, you had almost no Indian community when I lived there. Japan has a very small Indian community, primarily made up of Sindhi business people who moved to Kobe post 1947. Indonesia has a slightly larger Indian community, diasporic community, but again, it's mostly the Sindhi diasporic community. But that's pre-1947, and that's looking at diaspora. But all of these parts of Asia have been deeply influenced by Indian civilization more broadly, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And that, of course, the main thing is the transference of knowledge and culture through religion, be it Buddhism or Hinduism mediated through Buddhism. Indonesia, for example, was a largely a Hindu-Buddhist country for centuries before its conversion, or at least the conversion of large parts of it to Islam in the 17th century. And you see the embeddedness of that in its language and in its everyday rituals and in its everyday culture. I mean, for example, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the sort of great Hindu epics, are deeply embedded in Indonesian society. I remember, for example, there were these big ads on buses in Jakarta for a product called Puku Bhima. It was an energy drink, and it was supposed to give you the energy that Bhima from the Mahabharata gives you. And this is something that's immediately understood in Indonesia. Like if you were to say Bhim, strength. If you were to say Arjun, talent. If you were to say Yudhishthir, truthfulness. These kinds of associations of values with names from the Hindu epics are immediately intelligible in Indonesia, even today. If you go to China and you go to the famous Shaolin temple, we've all seen the 13 chambers of Shaolin, or we've known about the Kung Fu monks of Shaolin. The first thing you see is a statue that looks very Indian at the entrance. And then you discover that the Shaolin temple was founded by an Indian monk, that the Shaolin school of Kung Fu was developed by an Indian monk. You go to Japan, and the biggest temple in Tokyo is Sensoji. And the two guardian deities at the entrance to the temple are actually Japanese versions of the Indian gods Indra and Varun, who were incorporated into the Buddhist pantheon in Japan. So, I mean, the idea that Asia, is a sort of is connected civilizationally is something that becomes very apparent the more you travel across Asia. And I think we sort of lost those connections through the process of colonization and then decolonization, which emphasized autarky, so that individual countries kind of turned inwards and became very nationalistic. But if you look at it historically, there really has been a clasp of civilizations, and the movement of sailors, the movement of tradespeople, the movement of priests and religious figures, and the movement of soldiers has really, I think, woven a tapestry that means that there is something called an Asian civilization, even if today we have largely lost sight of that.
Thank you, ma'am.
Is it okay to take one last question?
Yeah, we'll have then. Yeah, Prince Albert. Yeah, Prince Albert will ask the last question.
Hi, ma'am. My name is Albert. Nice to meet you. And my question is, we who do not know the Japanese language feel that the sound ka, ik seems to dominate the Japanese language. The words feel more pronounced, and it looks like the language takes a lot of energy to speak. Can you give us some insight?
I don't know about the sounds. I actually think that the sounds in Japanese are quite easy. The easiest part about learning Japanese is the pronunciation, which is maybe a bit different to Chinese, where the pronunciation is different because it has tones. So Chinese is a tonal language where you have a very small number of sounds, ma, ba, ka, like that. But each of them can be said in 4 different ways. So ma, 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 ma. And they will have completely different meanings. Japanese is not tonal, and it has a much wider range of sounds, pretty much equivalent to English, if not some of the Indian languages, which are broader. What's difficult about Japanese is that, first of all, it has 3 scripts. It's kind of insane. It has a script called hiragana, which is their alphabet, like A, B, C, D, ka, kha, ga, gha in Hindi. Then it also has katakana, which I think I have a huge, ideological problem with, because katakana is essentially a script that mimics and mirrors all the alphabet sounds that exist in hiragana already, but katakana is a writing system that's used only and exclusively for foreign words. So the moment something is written in katakana, it signals the foreignness of the word. My name, Pallavi, your name, Albert, Joshua, Glenn, all of these would be written in katakana, so that the person reading it would immediately know foreign object. Pallavi is not Japanese, Glenn is not Japanese. So that's the only purpose of the existence of katakana, to signal foreignness. But please remember, it's a whole other completely different alphabet to hiragana that a foreign language learner has to learn. And then, of course, they have kanji, which are Chinese characters. So the way that the Chinese write their language, the Japanese also use Chinese characters. And in fact, Chinese characters are the most commonly used way of, in literature, for example. Hiragana and katakana tend to be used more for, like, say, signs or billboards. It's kind of a childish language. It's the first thing that children learn. Educated people use Chinese characters. But as though Chinese characters were not complicated enough, they normally have 2 or 3 or up to 10 different readings of each character. Some that derive from the Chinese language and some that derive from indigenous Japanese language preceding the Chinese language. So Japanese is an incredibly difficult language to learn to read and write. And it also has a very complex, again, unlike Chinese, which is syntactically and grammatically very simple, Japanese is incredibly complicated, with all the verbs being conjugated constantly. Verbs are usually placed at the end of the sentence, so that when you hear the sentence, you have no idea what's happening in the sentence until you reach the end of the sentence, which is why I feel very bad for interpreters who are trying to interpret between Japanese and English simultaneously. So it's definitely a very challenging language to learn. Also a very hierarchical language with completely different endings to verbs. If you're a man, if you're a woman, if you are older, if you are younger, depending on where you are in the pecking order. It doesn't just change the declination of the verbs, but the entire sentence structure. To give you a very quick example, you might say, I saw my friend. But if you were to say, I saw my teacher, you couldn't say, I saw my teacher, because the teacher is, so you have to be more respectful towards the teacher. So the entire sentence would change from, I saw my friend, to my eyes fell upon the teacher, to show the respect. So it's a completely different sentence depending on what object you are talking about. So yes, challenging indeed.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pallavi. It was a pleasure listening to you. Now over to Josiah Emmanuel for concluding remarks.
Yes, ma'am, thank you for your beautiful session. I consider this my privilege to express a heartfelt thanks to all of those who are instrumental for this event, especially Ms. Pallavi. So I thank, first of all, Dr. M. Dauman Christopher, Principal Secretary, Democrat College, for his encouragement and support to all of SCILET's programs so far. Also, I would like to thank Dr. Pramila Paul, Director, SCILET, for being a beacon of inspiration and leadership. And also thank the department heads, Dr. M. Radhendra Pandian, Head in Charge, Postgraduate Research Department of English, and Dr. J. Paul Jacob, Head in Charge of English Department SF, and all the faculty members for their esteemed presence and participation in this event. Also, thank Ms. Pallavi for enthusiastically responding to our invitation and for your valuable insights. Thank you, ma'am. So I'd like to express my thanks to the SCILET team, especially Ebi sir, GB sir, Pavitra, Raniaka, Jalakshmi, and Jansi for being the prime movers behind this literary feast. And finally, a special note of thanks for Professor Joel and Professor David for their time and efforts and constant love for SCILET and its activities. And, yeah, I also thank all the participants for actively listening and responding to the lecture. And thank you all for the questions asked. And hope you have gotten your all of your questions answered. And thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Pallavi, thank you so much for giving us so much time. It's actually Joel, Emmanuel, Ganesh Babu, all of them who really encourage the students to read many of your books. So we had fun reading all your books.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure to be here and to interact with the students in particular, and a real honor to be asked. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll stay in touch. Thank you for all your time.
With pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.